Over here, is that no? All right, Sam, I'll turn it over to you. Welcome back.
Thanks so much, Drake, and appreciate the kind introduction, and always wonderful to be with you. I want to let Drake off the hook here. The fact that we're starting at 9:05 is not his fault. It's my fault. I told him my excuse today is kind of a good one, not a good one, but my wife Helen is out of town with her parents, and when she's not around, the trains don't run quite as much on time.
The wheels come off.
Yeah, exactly. So no better excuse other than that, but I appreciate the forbearance in that regard. So we've been talking about relationships, and we've dealt with family relationships in the context of Jacob and Esau, and again in the Joseph story in Genesis. And now last week we talked about Ruth, which really allowed us to get into sort of gender issues, to the particular precarious circumstances of widows in the ancient world, but also how that might speak to us today in terms of just some of the loyalty that is exhibited in the book of Ruth by the various characters. So we're going to finish on a somewhat lighter note with the book of Jonah, which I think should give us an indication that the biblical authors, at least some of them, had a sense of humor. Jonah is not a serious book. It has serious points to make, but it is meant to be, it provides a bit of comic relief in the midst of heavy prophetic works. And I think that we could all, that church is and should be a place of deep spiritual reflection. Oftentimes we have to deal with major life passages that involve pain and difficulty. And yet it seems to me that in Protestantism and in the Peace USA in particular, we could stand to turn up the fun factor about, maybe 20 notches. Because we tend to do things decently in order, which is important, but then we sometimes leave out the fun aspect as well. One just very brief, I did a workshop yesterday on the wonders and pitfalls of sports in the ancient world and today, and I followed a magician in the program at this weekend retreat at River Road Church Baptist up the street. So they're doing this thing called Weekend of Wonder, just about how can we reattain wonder after COVID and all we have been experiencing over the last couple of years, which I thought was just a wonderful thing. So they're trying to up the fun factor. We'll try to do it today with the book of Jonah. But I do want to give a bit of background to the book. The book's protagonist is simply identified by his name. Who this figure is somewhat beside the point when we look at this book, but we can identify probably who was in mind. There's an 8th century prophet named Jonah ben Mattai, who was active during the reign of Jeroboam II, which is 8th century BCE, middle of the 8th century. He's mentioned in 2 Kings 14:22, this prophet Jonah, and he foretells the king's expansion to the sea in 2 Kings 14:25. Now,
That's me.
I didn't mean to click on that.
okay, so that's very prophetic that I get it. So this is simply a place marker or an identifier for the author of this book to continue. There's no biblical scholar who would consider this Jonah to be the figure that we read about in the book. The passage in 2 Kings mentioned the king expanding to the sea, which probably made the author of Jonah think, okay, this guy hung out around the ocean. So it was basically a catchphrase that allowed the author to write the story. We'll get into sometimes you will hear debates happening as to that seem to me to be missing the point. That we have debates sometimes in the church. Well, was Daniel really in the lion's den? Did Jonah really truly get swallowed by the whale? This is a legend. Now, whether it's true or not, is almost beside the point. It's what is the story designed to teach us? What is it designing to tell us about identity, about our relationship with God, and about who this figure of Jonah is? This is not meant to be read as a historical document, as a historical rendition. It is meant to make a series of points about humanity and God. So those types of debates that we sometimes have that can be painstaking can also be somewhat pointless. So we can come back to that if you wish. Let's start with the, if you could go Hannah, to the second slide.
Okay.
So the book begins, it's quite short, and probably was a story that people would have been able to tell orally as well, but it's really just fun. It's a fun little story. So the beginning, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Again, we're coming back to that passage in Kings. Go at once to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out to it, for their wickedness has come to me. But Jonah set out to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa, found a ship going to Tarshish, so he paid his fare and went on board. All right, so this is, most prophetic books begin with the prophet being called in sort of a great narrative in which he is blessed with divine wisdom and instruction. And here, Jonah's told to go somewhere, and he sets off in the other direction. It really is sort of like Keystone Cops. If you want to think of a prophetic, think of Adam Sandler. Think of Adam Sandler as a prophet, just getting on the ship and going in the other direction. This is, he doesn't do it the right way, or the way you're supposed to do it. He goes towards Joppa and Tarshish. Now God gets mad, sends a huge storm, and the sailors try to row back before throwing Jonah overboard. I mean, they're trying to not have to do it, but they realize it's Jonah's God who's mad at him for going in the other direction. And you know what happens next. Jonah is swallowed by a whale, or a very large fish. Hebrew there is dag, which means, a whopper of a fish. Not necessarily a whale, but I mean, a whale would be one of the animals that would be big enough to swallow a human, presumably. So that's the way it's usually translated. Let's go to the next slide. So the Lord provides a large fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. This is often seen among some Christian readings to be a precursor to the death and resurrection of Jesus. It's mentioned a couple of times in the New Testament. And so you do have a sort of sense of God providing deliverance to Jonah. Just a side point, that picture was taken by yours truly off the coast of Cape Cod, where we go every summer. And we've gone, Helen's favorite thing to do is to go whale watching when we're up there. So we go every year, and it's so cool because they've been able to identify, the same whales migrate from the Caribbean up to the Cape every year. I don't know, our favorite one you can read about is Salt. And Salt now I read last night, Salt has had great grandchildren now. And whenever she has calves, if she doesn't have calves that year, she stays away, but she has calves, she brings them up to the boat and sort of presents them to the tourists. And this was one of the years Salt had kids, and I don't remember if that one is Salt, the female humpback whale. I always think of Jonah when I'm out there off the shores of Cape Cod. So Jonah goes into the belly of the fish. Let's go to the next one. And the waters close in on Jonah. What we have in chapter 2 is a psalm of thanksgiving that you would just as easily find in the book of Psalms. The waters closed in over me, the deep surrounded me, weeds wrapped around my head at the roots of the mountains. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever, yet you brought up my life from the pit. And so it talks about Jonah's feelings of helplessness followed by God's deliverance, which is that type of movement from despair to gratitude shows up everywhere in the book of Psalms. So this, now, it was probably included into the story to demonstrate God's faithfulness to Jonah. Whether the original author included it is a matter of great debate, which we're not going to spend any time on today. I would note that the notion of the pit or the sea in the Old Testament, the pit or Sheol, well, really can often be seen as a watery place, that it is a, we hear the word watery grave, that when you descend into darkness in some of these Psalms, it often involves going underwater or going into the bottom of the ocean where help is not available and darkness surrounds. So Jonah is cast out and then is then given new life after 3 days. So interestingly, we get to chapter 3 and we kind of have a repeat of what happened in chapter 1. Again, the comedy is, he goes the wrong way, he gets thrown overboard, he gets swallowed up, spit back out, and now we're going to try again. So in chapter 3, he's told once again to go to Nineveh. Let's go to the next slide. All right, we'll come to that in a minute. God tells Jonah again to go to Nineveh, a great city that is teeming with people. 3 days walk across, the text tells us. This time Jonah fulfills God's command and tells the Ninevites to repent. Everyone from the king to the smallest of children does so, and even the animals. We'll see this in a minute. Even the animals don sackcloth. I'll come to that in just a minute. So Nineveh is a great capital in the ancient world. It is the capital during the period of the 8th century of the Assyrian Empire. It would be an international city teeming with activity, with trade, with lots of people. And one should also note it would be teeming with people who were not Israelites, who were not part of God's covenant community, who would follow the religions of Mesopotamia. Nineveh would be located in modern day Iran. I mean, we're many centuries before Islam, but this would be much more of a cosmopolitan, imperial, administrative city than anything that we would find in Israel. So, so Jonah is told to go to basically a place inhabited by foreigners to him, and so this is to deliver God's message, and he does so, and he tells the Ninevites to repent, and the news reaches the king of Nineveh. He rises from his throne, removes his robe, covers himself with sackcloth and satin ashes. He had a proclamation made in Nineveh by the decree of the king and his nobles. No human being or animal, no herd or flock shall taste anything. They shall not feed, nor shall they drink water. Human beings and animals shall be covered with sackcloth. They shall cry mightily to God in a gesture of repentance. All shall turn from their evil ways and from the violence that is in their hands. Who knows? God may relent and change his mind. He may turn from his fierce anger, so we do not perish. We're going to come back in just a second to the notion of God changing God's mind, which is really interesting. And we'll talk about that for a minute. But just go to the next slide, Ian. Just to show you how silly this is, somebody sent me you have to visualize it sometime. A cow walking around in mourning clothes and sackcloth, meant to be like not just the humans, but the animals are going to wear gestures of mourning, so that the repentance is completely total. All right, so go back to the last slide, actually. Okay, let's stop for a minute on this. Who knows? God may relent and change his mind. He may turn from his fierce anger so that we do not perish. Really interesting theological statement here, which would suggest, okay, how do we negotiate this? If we have an all-powerful, omnipotent, transcendent God whose knowledge is vast and who knows what we're going to do before we're going to do it, why would we even open the possibility that God can change God's mind? This shows up a couple of times in the Bible. Anybody think of where else it shows up? This is a Final Jeopardy question. So God changes God's mind a couple of times in the flood story. God gets mad that God made humanity and decides to send the flood. God, oftentimes it's translated, God repented of God's decision to create the world. I'm going to erase it and do a do-over. When Saul is king, God says, whoa, he's not doing the job I want to do. I think Saul gets a bum rap. That's another lesson. But God decides to go with David. God repents or changes God's mind of making David king. Now, here is even more interesting in my judgment, because it suggests that God can change God's mind based on human behavior, human repentance, human acts of contrition will assuage divine wrath, will lead to a different outcome, which I find to be quite noteworthy. Let's go past the cow to the next slide. When God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil ways, God changed his mind about the calamity he said he would bring upon them, and he did not do it. Which seems to be possible in the Old Testament. Anybody have thoughts on that? Would suggest that we have some sort of, yeah, go ahead. You have your hand up.
Well, there's several occasions where in the Bible where God states that a change in human behavior change his position.
Right.
So there's a barter.
So that's a really good point. So what's another place where bartering occurs? Here's another Final Jeopardy question. This story is often compared to a different story where there's bartering going on and the people are destroyed. Oh, anybody, did you think of when Abraham is bargaining with God over Sodom? He says, he's like, if there's 50 righteous people, would you give us a break? Here, it works. With Abraham, it doesn't. God said, well, get the heck out of Dodge because everybody's going down. But in Jonah, it works because everybody repents. So it does suggest there is a conversation going on, and that repentance and a change of heart can lead God to a different outcome. Now, some people have trouble with this because it would suggest that everything's not foreordained, that we have some agency to enact or change the outcome of something based on our attitude and response to what we think God is asking us to do. That things are still fluid and not completely deterministic, which is interesting. There's what's that?
Isn't that essential?
Yes, but it is often, I think it is essential, but it seems to bump up against some of what we have in the Reformed tradition when we talk about Calvinism and everything being predestined. So that, God has decided the outcome and we are in God's hands. But that because God is so all-knowing, it's pretty much a fait accompli what's going to happen. I agree that it does seem to be necessary to allow for changes in behavior, changes of the heart that might lead to a different outcomes, hopefully better, but maybe sometimes worse as well. So I guess it's often seen to be a theological conundrum, especially for those of us who are in the Reformed tent. But here it is in this colorful story that God changes God's mind and decides not to bring the God's wrath onto the Ninevites. Now, what's Jonah's response? He gets mad. He's like, I don't want you to be merciful. I don't want you to show any kindness to these foreigners, these Ninevites. I want you to take care of them. So let's go to the next slide. This was very displeasing to Jonah. He became angry. He prayed to the Lord. He said, oh Lord, this is not is this not what I said while I was still in my own country? That is why I fled to Tarshish at the beginning. For I know you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, ready to relent from punishing. So Jonah's saying to God, I don't want you to be that way. I don't want you to show mercy to them. Why? I was bringing them an oracle of judgment, and I want you to follow through on that. I can't pity the Ninevites, and so he wishes to die. So he'd rather not see this play out. So he goes outside Nineveh to make kind of a spectator's hut. God gives him a shrub to protect him from the sun, and then God sends a worm to attack the shrub, and then a wind. And so Jonah gets sunburned and exhausted, and he gets riled up again. So they have sort of a standoff outside of the city. It's like Jonah's gone to one of those all-day concerts and hasn't worn his sunblock on the 4th of July. He's kind of, you could maybe picture him being kind of bald and cranky and sun, just baked by the sun, hasn't eaten. And here's go to the next slide. I've always been a sports junkie. I grew up in Atlanta and always loved Doc Rivers when he played for the Hawks, and just thought of this picture that I'd seen last year when Doc was unhappy with a call. And of course, most of you know who the guy on the left is, John McEnroe at his height. I was at a match one time in Atlanta, and somebody was taunting him from the audience, and he said, take a long walk off a short pier. And everybody knows so he would get so incredulous when a call wouldn't go his way. Anybody remember his famous catchphrase? You cannot be serious. That was the thing he would always say. If the umpire made a call, it didn't go his way, he said, you cannot be serious. And I love Jonah. I've always liked McEnroe. I think he's one of the best announcers in any sport. I think he's, colorful. I didn't like his lack of sportsmanship, but I've always liked his, what a great competitor he was. Didn't like the tantrums. But I think these two pictures to me speak to the mix of bewilderment and astonishment and frustration that Jonah feels. As things seem to be spinning in a direction that he did not expect them to. All right, let's go to the next slide.
I've got a comment in the chat. You want it now or later?
Oh, let me just do one more thing, and then we'll play a lot of time for questions. God said to Jonah, is it right? This is the end of the book. Is it right for you to be angry about the bush? And he said, yes, angry enough to die. The Lord said, you were concerned about the bush for which you did not labor and which you did not grow. It came into being in a night and perished in a night. Should I not be concerned about Nineveh, that great city, in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also many animals? So, interesting conclusion to the book. It ends with a question, and Jonah doesn't get to answer. This is the last line of the book. Most stories wrap up neatly with a bow. This one doesn't. Jonah's saying, you're mad that you lost your son, the tree that was blocking you. You're mad that, that I'm showing that I haven't, destroyed you when you wanted to be, because I'm showing mercy to the Ninevites, and you're mad about me showing mercy to the Ninevites. Jonah's basically saying, like McEnroe, you cannot be serious, and God is saying, shouldn't I be concerned about this huge city? Isn't my job as creator and protector and judge of all things different from your job? So in a sense, the book ends with God scolding Jonah for being so, picky, self-righteous, and concerned with how he wanted the story to end, rather than with how God wanted the story to end. All right. Well, I'm going to say a couple other things, but let's take the question and see what it is.
Was there a historical enmity between Hebrews and Ninevites, or is Jonah just mad that God changed his mind after Jonah eventually did what God commanded?
That's a really good question. Yes, there was historical enmity between Ninevites / Assyrians and Israelites. And they invaded Israel and Judah multiple times. They were a much more powerful military presence. They worshipped different deities, and they would have been again a colonial presence in Israel in the 8th century. In 722, the northern kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrians. So there was great historical enmity between them. He does have reason to dislike this, and for that reason, there has been, I think, some have said we should be more sympathetic to Jonah because he has some historical grievances that would lead him in this direction. And so therefore his it's a really, really good question. His anger is perhaps historically justified. Really good question. All right. So let's talk a little bit more about what happens in chapter 4, though, and how we might take the book as a whole, and think about some of what we've done in the last couple of weeks as well. Rather than pouting about what has or hasn't happened, we could perhaps Jonah is a living example, sort of broadening the reading, that God's love knows no ethnic or religious boundary. That the Ninevites were certainly not Israelite or Jewish, and we might rethink some of our assumptions based on the book about hierarchy and institutional structure. So perhaps Jonah can be sort of a witness to us to have a sense of humor, and perhaps also to realize that God's mercy and God's ways are much broader and bigger than anything we can possibly imagine. And that when we get into dividing peoples into one group or another, it can quickly become, problematic. That, in other words, we can take comfort that Jonah's God is in charge, not us. That this is a God who values tolerance, devotion, who's merciful. Certainly we see moments of judgment in the Bible, and a God who's not entirely predictable. It seems to me that Jonah points to the unpredictability of God, whose ways we don't fully understand. God rescues Jonah in Jonah's distress. God watches over our comings and goings, but God also shows mercy to the Ninevites. So let me show another slide, the last slide. This is one of my favorite quotes. It's by an Anglican priest who spent most of his career in India, where I also have spent a couple of years of my life teaching and studying. And just when I read Jonah and I read about Nineveh, I think about, Bangalore, where I've lived a portion, and some of the other cities in South India where I've lived, which are just teeming with life. And Mary D has been to India, and she knows that just standing there walking, watching the world go by, people walk down the street is 80% of the reason to go. You just see so much activity and so much diverse activity. Our first task in approaching another people, another culture, another religion is to take off our shoes for the place we are approaching as holy. Else we may find ourselves treading on people's dreams. More seriously still, we may forget that God was here before our arrival. So it seems to me, I don't know, one could do a reading of Jonah that pushes us against xenophobia, that pushes us against treating the foreigner as an enemy or as different from us. We could do a reading of Jonah that says God's mercy extends far beyond our capacity to understand it. And that it seems to me that we don't have to worry about who is saved or who God favors or who is going to heaven. None of those things is our job. That's God's job. That we're not God, and we don't get to decide it. One of the things I think that gets Jonah into trouble is he's upset with the way things are going. And he focuses on decisions that are God's to make, not his. And so, I just think of myself and think of, when I'm not happy with the outcome of something, and, I think of Jonah and I think of John McEnroe, you can't be serious, that there is a sense in our relationships, but also in our sort of global and communal relationships, that God's mercy is perhaps more vast and more complex and more unpredictable than we might first think it is. So I would like to put this passage and the end of Jonah in conversation with readings that would suggest or focus on an exclusivist understanding that talks again and again about, who's favored, who's saved, when those aren't our decisions to make. Those aren't things we have to worry about. We just have to worry about being the most faithful disciples of God and Jesus Christ we can be, and let God take care of God's job. So that's it. Now, to come, well, let me see if anybody has any responses to that. And then I'm going to maybe flip that on its head along the lines of the questions. But anybody have thoughts on anything I've talked about in the book of Jonah, or especially what I've said at the end about sort of God's ways can be unpredictable?
So when we tell the story of Jonah to our children and we illustrate it as a fish, we're really lying to them.
Well, how are we lying?
Well, we made it real in the sense of the fish.
Well, isn't
of the whale.
right? Well, I don't think that's you could go either way on that. I mean, I would say, yes, that discussion gets had. I would say whale, and not worry about it, because it's the word there is dog. This is one of the sort of part of the minutia we could get into, and I'm as guilty of this as a biblical scholar as anybody. Like I look at a word and say, well, what does it mean? What's the sort of range of what it means? I mean, the whale doesn't go to the, off the coast of Joppa. There's not huge humpback whales off in the Mediterranean.
Right.
So like there are, in Cape Cod and Maine. But I guess just, moving back more broadly, you can say, well, how, again, you're not lying, Bruce, because the story is important and real in the sense that it's persisted for thousands of years. And it's one of the coolest stories in the Bible. And, whether or not Jonah was historically actually swallowed by a whale is less important than the message that it brings, and the fact that it was a tale that was told for centuries as an expression of who God is. So it's the same thing as what we refer to as the court tales in Daniel, the three youths in the furnace, Daniel in the lion's den. How relevant is it as to whether that really happened? The stories are meant to express how we are to act in relation to each other and in relation to God. That's why this is referred to as a folk tale or a folk legend, and that's referred to as a court tale. It's real in the sense that it is emblematic of how we are to act. And I think sometimes we get bogged down. It doesn't make you a liar. I think sometimes we get bogged down in historicity questions within Protestantism in a way that, for instance, our Jewish friends and our Catholic friends don't. They don't concern themselves so much with that as we do. And so I would just encourage you to tell the story with flair and with confidence, because it's such an important central story in the tradition, and not worry about whether it's a whale or a fish.
So I begin the conversation by saying, this is a story.
Well, why do you even have to do that? I mean, I guess you could, but when we get into historical Jonah conversations, and I'm not saying this is what you're doing, when we get into historical Jonah conversations, we miss the point. Because then we start talking about, okay, when did this Jonah live? The actual book of Jonah So we've got this figure in the 8th century. The actual book of Jonah was probably written several hundred years later during the Persian Empire, about the time Ruth was written. So remember we talked last week about Ruth and the fact that Ruth is responding to Ezra and Nehemiah because they have a very exclusivist understanding of marriage and of who can associate with who, that it's only the very tightly controlled community. You can't intermarry, and everybody else needs to be sent away in exile. Jonah is written during the same period, also as a response to Ezra and Nehemiah and the exclusivist understanding there, to say God's mercy, God's relationship extends far beyond us. It can extend even to these Ninevites, who some would have considered to be idolatrous. So it's a story. I mean, isn't it the case that, well, as we think about our nation's history and some of the stories that are associated with our founding, you know, some of them are doubtless true and based on truths, but they are often embellished or, you know, combined with stories that sort of illustrate what America is, that are part of sort of our national thread work. And we don't have to really concern ourselves how much with what is exactly historically true. Yes.
Yeah. Well, like Jonah, I've known a lot of people that have been in those hopeless situations, or like myself being in those hopeless situations. And you kind of you have this back and forth about, okay, you know, open the door and jump out, and you say, okay, you idiot, you know you're gonna die.
Yeah.
So you gotta kind of maintain your wits about you and not think, oh God, why did you put me in this situation? And not give up.
Right.
And keep your wits about you.
Well, and yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, you know, and you're speaking to sort of Jonah's desperation and sense of fatalism, especially in that first chapter, when he's, you know, and they all kind of, when they cast lots, and it's like, okay, you know, it shows that they were, you know, the ship guys, that they're kind of, they try to make it so that Jonah can stay on board. It's clear that's not going to work. They have to throw him overboard. And yeah, he sort of alternates between desperation and hopelessness and anger. And the story ends with him ticked. But you're right to point out in that first chapter, there's sort of a desperation about him that he kind of knows or thinks he's going to die. And you know, certainly for those who have been in that situation, they can identify with Jonah's sort of feelings of helplessness and despair. I think that's helpful. Yeah.
Aren't you limiting the power of the all-powerful God when you say that can't really happen?
No, because I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm saying that if we try to, I think God's capacity is limitless. But if we try to identify this historically, we can get, what's the expression that everybody uses? You lose the forest for the trees, because you get into historical questions as to exactly when this happened, and you fail to explore the broader message there. So I absolutely don't think I'm limiting the power of God. I think I'm also engaging the Bible as literature, which is something we have to do. And we can look and say, there's multiple other legends. I pointed to Daniel. There's some stories that are outside of the Protestant canon, one called Ahikar, one called Judith, some other sort of Tobit is in the Catholic canon. All these stories have fantastical elements and threads in common that speak to how a believing Israelite or Jew in the Persian period after the exile is to conduct themselves. And so we can compare that and say, okay, Jonah has a pretty interesting, almost radical message about tolerance, about acceptance that God is God and we are not, and that to resonate with the story and to resonate with the timelessness of the story is far more productive than asking, did this truly happen? I'm not trying to limit God at all. What I am doing is trying to figure out when this story was written and why it was written. And I'm arguing, as not me, but many others, I'm arguing that it was written as a response to a more exclusive separatist understanding, such as we find in Ezra and Nehemiah.
5 minutes.
So,
5 minutes.
okay,
And I've
There was
got a
a-
comment in the chat when
Okay,
you're
go
ready
ahead.
for it. We've got one
all
here.
right. Well, there's another question over here, but yeah, go ahead with the
Right.
chat.
There does seem to be a tradition of large fish in the Hebrew Bible, for example, Leviathan in Genesis and Psalms.
Oh, that's a really good question too. The fish, and this gets to your question as well. The sea, fish, the ocean have a mythological sort of resonance in the Bible. You think about what's the seminal event in Israelite history? It's the Exodus and the crossing of the sea. The Hebrew word for sea there is a Canaanite deity. So when you go down into the sea, you're not just drowning, you're going into the sort of underwaters that have, that are, just thinking back to the second chapter of Jonah, the pit is closing in on me. There's a real sense of desperation and almost mythological danger when we talk about the ocean. So I think that's a really, really good point. And you have in Genesis 1, in Job and elsewhere, you have the sea monster Leviathan. So the sea is not a safe sort of ordinary place in the context of the book of Jonah. It is seen to be dangerous and precarious. It's not like me and Helen, tootling around Cape Cod looking for salt. So it's much more serious than that. There was a question over here, I think. Yeah, go ahead.
I appreciate what you're doing towards the end of helping us understand how to distinguish between the historical nature of the Bible and the metaphorical importance of the Bible. If we're called to be evangelical to some degree, I don't imagine that God's intent was for us to bring Baptists over to Presbyterian Church. And when we encounter non-believers, it's very easy for them to criticize these metaphorical stories. That can't possibly be true. And if they can throw up more objections in 30 seconds than you or we can address in 30 minutes.
Right. No, that's a good question. Yeah.
So it's very difficult in a modern society to address these complexities that come from the
Absolutely.
metaphorical Bible. We appreciate your attempts to help us reach that wall, but it does seem a complicated path in how we would address things that are this subtle
Right.
in our encounters in our everyday lives.
Boy, that's a good question. And that'd be a good topic for another series too. I know we got to stop in just a minute.
So is
So
that March, Sam?
what's that?
Is that March?
Yeah, maybe it's March. So it's a really good question, especially when we have those who would seek to caricature the Bible and Christianity and sort of, I think of Richard Dawkins. I don't care if this is recorded. The one who really gets under my skin is Bill Maher. Just the way he caricatures and it's just so condescending that you're absolutely right. It becomes problematic. I think that it's helpful to it's a longer answer to say that one of the problems, it's not the problems, it's one of the issues we face, because it's not a problem, we don't limit God's capacity for the miraculous. We don't limit God's capacity to intervene in what happens in our lives and what has happened in a miraculous way, even as we also read the Bible in its original context. And we look at when it was written, why it was written, and just some of these questions that we might ask of other ancient literature. I mean, that is part of what we do when we study. I do want to come back in my final point. Is there any more comments in the chat, or can I finish?
Not yet. There's nothing
Okay,
there.
all right. So, but just to finish, also to remember again about Nineveh, that just to think about Richmond and how Richmond is diversified. and how Richmond is so much more a map of the world than it was a decade or 20 years ago. And that we are living in a modern day Nineveh in a certain sense, because the people down our street might come from another part of the planet than we come from. We have just every ethnic group in Richmond represented. And there is a sense in which Jonah points us towards tolerance, acceptance, and that perhaps God's mercy and graciousness extends far beyond our capacity to understand it. And that this is, I think, a helpful message for us today. So that rather than sitting at home or on our back porch sunburned and angry, that we engage in our community and we try to get to know the person down the street and try to see how we might relate to them with the book of Jonah in mind. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. And always a pleasure to have you, not only this year, but in past years. We appreciate your dedication and willingness to come back and teach us. Speaking of engaging in the community, Ben Campbell will be with us the next 2 Sundays. Y'all know Ben, he is a pastoral associate at St. Paul's. He is a civil rights activist here in Richmond. He's author of Richmond's Unhealed History. If you haven't read it or listened to some video that he is
Really interesting, and I learned a lot.
lectures on it, you should
From a
do
history
that. He's also
standpoint.
founder of Richmond Hill. So a nice segue to
Yeah,
the next
no,
2 weeks, and he's relatively newbie to the Covenant class, not new to Richmond, obviously. But anyway, look forward to seeing y'all next week. Have a happy and safe week.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.